Civil society organisation Equal Education is asking the Department of Basic Education to put in place interventions to ensure that learners who depend on school feeding schemes nationally continue to receive meals. Now, Equal Education also wants the department to lead the programme and not defer its responsibilities to other departments. The Western Cape Education Department has been both commended and criticised for implementing an emergency school feeding scheme for pupils who depend on schools for a daily meal. Now, the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education has voiced its concern about the Western Cape continuing with the National Food Nutrition Programme despite the national lockdown. Joining us now via Skype is the General Secretary of the Equal Education NGO, then that's Noncedo Madubedube. Thanks so much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you so much for inviting us and having us on the show.
Noncedo, let's start here. You're imploring departments to resume the feeding scheme despite prevailing COVID-19 circumstances and the view that the emergency scheme poses a huge risk in this regard. Please explain to us why that is.
You know what the situation is, that during lockdown, the announcement of the lockdown, the president had sort of assured the country that there will be an interministerial or interdepartmental cooperation around interventions for COVID. And as a couple of organizations, including Section 27, the Equal Education Law Center, Children's Institute, Center for Child Law, a group of us that work with children's rights, work with young people on a daily basis, and work around education in the sector, we thought, look, the Department of Basic Education isn't playing its part. It isn't involved in responses that the Department of Health, the Department of Social Development together are working on to ensure that there's food and nutrition security during this period. And so what we're thought is that there are examples across the world of interventions where learners are able to pick up food packages. In a country like South Africa, the most unequal in the world, it's almost worrying or scary to think about what learners that depend on school nutrition are going through at the moment. Because the effects of this kind of lockdown for families that are working class and poor in rural and township communities have been hit 3- or 4-fold by the lockdown. So there isn't any sort of formal labor or work that parents are able to make money from and feed their families. And learners are at home predominantly, and circumstances have changed inside those communities as well. So there's no better time, a more urgent time or need for food security that is nutritious. And we've got a whole program that fits that description, which is the school nutrition program. And it's a national competency. And we know that billions of money, of rands, go towards the nutrition program. And so we think, we're asking the question rather, where is that money gone to? We know that it's been demarcated to provinces at the moment, and we're saying we need a district level approach that ensures that every learner can go to their nearest school, so not necessarily the school that they go to pick up a food package, stagger the times and slots, put safeguards in place to ensure that as learners and whoever will be facilitating the program to drop or distribute food is safe, and there's water and sanitizers available at these different points, and physical distancing, of course. We're also calling the department to think creatively about how to use scholar transport, for example. And we're saying we could use these buses and taxis to further bolster the access to school nutrition programs at this time. We're worried because Angie Matsaka had said, look, we're going to work out inside a sort of a centralized approach. We'll be systematic. What the Department of Basic Education does, provinces will do in the same way. But the Western Cape, for example, has heeded the call to ensure that children and learners during this period don't go hungry. Hunger and malnutrition are one of the top priorities for kids in particular, because outside of that realm, they become immune to catching COVID or having compromised immune systems. And during a health pandemic, we need to make sure that everyone's safe, fed, and with anything else is a basic human right. So the response by the DBE to say, look, we won't be able to be factoring ourselves into any part of the what are these things, the interventions, and rather to rely on the Department of Social Development solely through SASSA pickup points has proven to be unsuccessful, or rather a careless suggestion, if anything. And we're saying we need a clear and concise plan to make sure that learners are fed in the next 2 weeks, because lockdown continues till the end of April. And these are some of the things that we're suggesting. Use your scholar transport buses, open up those schools and declare them an essential service facility, stagger times, and groups and numbers for people to come in and collect food parcels. And in fact, use the school nutrition fund that's available, that's already there. to bolster and make sure that this thing happens. And I mean, we already know that social development is using in the range of about 900 million from its disaster relief fund to ensure that these food packages are going out. And in provinces like Gauteng, where Lesufi is then the minister, the MEC of Education and Social Development, we can see some of that movement taking place. And we know that some of our members of Equal Education in the East Rand have said they have received a food package, a food parcel. So it's possible. But there has to be political will on the side of the Department of Basic Education. Creative and less careless interventions are necessary during this time.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but given the amicable tone in your letter, it seems that Equal Education does understand and appreciate the predicament that the department finds itself in, and that this is, of course, a very serious balancing act that the department needs to do in order to satisfy both circumstances. Again, you have outlined how you think they should go about it, but I would imagine that you do have some sympathy for the position they find themselves in.
I don't know what defines frontline during this period, right? There's sympathies around the fact that it's a difficult circumstance, and so the ability to think about responding to a condition that you've never found yourself in is difficult. But scenario planning will prove that having learners that are hungry, malnutritioned, means that they aren't able to take into account the things, the interventions the Department of Basic Education has, for example, put in place around learning through television and radio, and using enrichment material to keep reading and learning during this period. And using these WhatsApp groups with teachers to make sure that everyone's catching up and in full swing of some part of the traditional, normal education. But all of those things can't happen if folk are hungry. And I think part of what the Department of Basic Education, which at least is captured inside the objectives of the CAPS curriculum, and therefore the principles the DBE stands for, are around making sure that the basic needs and human dignity is protected of young people. And that's something that's amiss, unfortunately, in the interventions that are in place at the moment. And that's the role of the DBE. That's the role of the Department of Basic Education, to take care of its learners first. And so should be trying to find the best and any way possible to get involved in the relief programs, as opposed to going, learners are members of the communities and parents are used to school holidays, so people shall self-govern and make sure and be okay. Godspeed to everyone. That isn't the response of a responsible leader. And we're hoping to, through this message, put pressure on the Department of Basic Education, support some of the initiatives that are coming out of the Western Cape and in Gauteng to make sure that food parcels reach learners. And these are some of the interventions we say could bolster and make sure that there's an efficiency around this enrollment. Because the reality is that standing at a podium, or even us through the Skype call, making these proclamations and declarations doesn't mean that learners in the most marginalized parts of the country are experiencing the relief. And that's something we've come to know as missing. And so it's an urgent call, if anything else, inside understanding that all of the circumstances is difficult for everyone.
So just on a bit more clarity once again, we've seen the images of government officials in provinces handing out food parcels. The question would be, what is the difference then between what they are doing and what the feeding schemes are meant to do?
The feeding schemes are a ring-fenced pot of money. They would bolster in thousands the reach of these food parcels. And we're unsure at this point what the current food parcels run in Gauteng, for example, how far they go, who they reach, who qualifies. And what we're saying is that there's a pot of money that's designated in particular for school learners and young children, and that money should be used and targeted for those community groups. So where learners are able to walk out of homes and go to pick up food, they should be given that allowance.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it for this morning. Noncedo Madubedube, Equal Education's General Secretary, talking to us about the organization, asking the Department of Education to put in place interventions to ensure that children continue to receive school meals at this time of this COVID-19 lockdown.